We live in a world that is changing rapidly, and the rate of change is increasing every passing day. Our psyche is numbed by the technological blitzkrieg, our agency hijacked by the state, our senses inundated by the noise of consumerism. In such a scenario, we find it hard to make sense of the world, to find our place in it, and to create meaning from our action. It is clear that the way out of this psychological paralysis and meaningless struggle is to rekindle the fire of tradition and to draw from the huge body of knowledge handed down to us by our ancestors. In other words, all we need is dharma. But dharma is multifaceted and complex. It is not reducible to tropes that can be broadcast over mass media. Welcome to our new podcast, Dharma 101, in which Ashish and I will take part in a series of conversations in the hope of articulating the traditional perspective on some of the most pressing issues of our times. I am Aditya, and in this very first episode, we will talk about the most elementary question: what is tradition?
So it is all full credit to you, Aditya, for starting this podcast, because I am increasingly finding myself appearing in more and more podcasts on Upward itself. So it's almost like I'm paying myself to to appear on this channel because no one else would invite me. But the idea behind doing this podcast, as we had discussed, I think we should start with this disclaimer that whatever we are going to talk about is our perspective. We may even sometimes differ between ourselves, but this is the perspective of laymen. We are not by any stretch of imagination, we are not experts or authorities on matters of dharma. What we are trying to do here is that we are simply stating our position based on our understanding of tradition and dharma. And we may well be wrong. So anyone who finds mistakes, this disclaimer should clarify that we are not the final word on these things that we are talking about. The other objective of this series is that for the longest time now, at least the last 5 years, the discourse over social media, which is actually a barometer of how conversations are happening on the street. It's a more extreme version of that conversation, but it reflects the mindset of the people at large. So the conversations of social media have they kind of point to a schism in the Hindu society itself, between those who would call themselves faithful to the tradition and those who would maybe self-identify as progressives or more liberal inclined among the Hindu section. So I think my perspective is that there has to be a conversation between these two. Unfortunately, what has happened in these last few years is that there has been a very bad faith sort of engagement between these two sides, and people often caricature and create strawmen out of the other side, and then shoot them down. So I think that what we can do is that while we are presenting our case, which is for batting for the tradition, we should also do justice to the side that we do not agree with, by steel manning there or by indulging in some bit of Purva Paksha. And to start with, I think also a distinction has to be made between tradition and traditionalism, or what in social media parlance is called trad. Right? So I think I find the whole trad and these labels quite silly. But in the beginning, I did participate in a few of these dialogues. Or I appeared on some podcasts because I thought that this was an important conversation to have. Not because I was representing any particular side or, trying to show the other side in poor light. If I did so, I may have done it inadvertently, but that was not the intention. So let me start with saying that tradition itself is almost the entire body of knowledge that you inherit from the ancestors, as you said in your opening remarks. But traditionalism is a very, very simple ideology. And that ideology is basically return to tradition, return to the traditional way of thinking. That is all there is to traditionalism. There is nothing more to it. So traditionalism is just a pointer. It's like the finger pointing towards tradition, and it ends there. There is nothing more in it. So we should leave it at that and say that, okay, traditionalism points to the tradition. Now let us talk about tradition, as opposed to getting into unnecessary arguments and, mudslinging because we want to score points over someone. So, yeah.
But I was really curious, like, when did the very term trads, originated in the first place? Because when Modi came to power in 2014, or let's say in general, when Hindutva came into vogue in the past decade, everyone was pointing towards Hindutva as the, Brahmanical patriarchy and whatnot. But towards the end of at least last couple of years, we see the rise of this sort of dissident Hindu group, which has been labeled as trad. So you have been active on social media for a long time. So just a quick
the term trad is not of Indian origin anyway. Trad was a Western meme. Trads were those ultra-conservative Christians who advocated for all kinds of... they also advocated for a return to tradition. But what happens on social media is, because there is so much noise and us being outsiders to their discourse, I cannot really pinpoint what trad meant in the Western sphere. In the Indian context, in the Hindu context, trad became, like I said, trad is an ideology. But trad, people who began to be identified as trads had differing opinions on a wide variety of topics, including politics, including electoral politics, their choice of who to vote for and whom to discard. So I think that there was a general dissatisfaction with how democracy was playing out. In the beginning, it was just one whole bunch. And like you said, it was all leaning towards Hindutva. But some people began to get disillusioned by the political aspects of, or how the electoral politics was not giving them the due returns that they were expecting. So there were dissidents. Now, these dissidents also happen to have some more conservative takes on things. I think the first divergence happened between the economic right and the cultural right, where the economic right was all, very enthusiastic about the economic policies and free market principles that they imagined the Modi government to be espousing. Whether that was the case or not is a separate debate, but they came from that perspective. And the cultural right was more the ones about reclaiming temples and, what happened to Ram Janmabhoomi. Back then, the verdict had also not come. So it was all about that and freeing Hindu temples and, the Sabrimala agitation, things like that. So it galvanized a lot of people. So the cultural right and the economic right were sometimes in conflict. And I think from there, it graduated to this trad versus raita trope. But I don't think it is very important. Though it is a reflection of something which is more important, which is deeper.
Right.
And that is the mindset, that is the school of thought that you come from, how you look at tradition, how you understand tradition, and how you imagine the future of Hindu civilization.
Right. So just for the clarification, if you can just give a little differentiation between traditionalism and conservatism 101.
Like I said, traditionalism can simply be explained as a return to tradition. So it ends there. And now the next question that comes up is, what is tradition? Which is why we have chosen the very first episode to be about what is tradition, because unless you clarify that, it is prone to be hijacked, the term, and all sorts of strawmen will be created about it. So traditionalism is return to tradition. We will unpack what tradition is in the course of the episode. Right. Conservatism is slightly different. Conservatism is it's some sort of a double-faced thing, where you want to, like I explained in a recent podcast with someone, that where conservatives differ from liberals is not in the choice of destination, but in the way of getting there, in the mode of transport that they choose. That if both of us want to travel to Kanyakumari, you will take the flight and I will take the train. You will reach there early, so you are a liberal. I am a conservative because I lag behind. I'll come by train, I'll be 36 hours late to the party. So conservatives are that. They value tradition, but they don't value it enough to preserve it. They will eventually give up parts of it. And what happens when you give up parts of it will be clear as we discuss what tradition really is.
Tradition, the word itself has become akin to a hat which has been worn by so many different heads that for me it has lost the original shape. There are political traditions, there are religious traditions, there whatnot, like any kind of sociological succession has been named as tradition. And in that context, I think the real tradition and the traditionalism has to be differentiated from different other succession plans. So let's say the civilization is a continuation of certain practices which gives it the exceptional quality as a means of sustenance. It does not necessarily mean that they have underlying socio-economic logic or something like that, but it gives meaning to existence. It gives you the identity to mobilize your thoughts, ideas. In a sense, traditions build your identity. They give integrity to your identity. You could be anything. Now there are people who define themselves by their affection towards their favorite movie stars, for example, but that is not tradition, because that identity has not gained enough integrity. It's not akin to a family heirloom. On the other hand, tradition, the ancestry based tradition, they have their entire chain of command behind them. It gives you a semblance of a sense of belongingness, which binds you together with your geography, with your culture, with your people. It makes you one with your immediate surroundings. And this was the case for most of the human population before the advent of the modern industrial revolution and mass media, where in just one clean sweep we were exposed to all of the nitty-gritty details of all the world. What's happening in one corner of the world is going to affect me if I am invested, emotionally invested in that. But that was not the case for most part of human history. So tradition, in a sense, is something which gives me a sense of belongingness, which I have acquired from my, ancestry.
Right. Like you rightly said, I mean, tradition can be used in various contexts. The word, and that is the nature of human language, that any word which is a symbol represents some reality. And that reality, you can use the word in different contexts and it will point to different realities. So even, filmmaking tradition, let's say the school of some great filmmaker like Alfred Hitchcock. So that is a tradition of filmmaking. Now, but that is a very limited definition. When we speak of tradition as a whole, when we speak of tradition in the singular, like you have civilizations, you have Islamic civilization, you have European civilization, Christian civilization, Judo-Christian civilization, modern civilization, ancient civilization, any prefix and the meaning changes. So that is civilization in the plural. But when you talk about civilization as a singular, you talk about human civilization. And then you say the whole story of how humanity and how Homo sapiens evolved and things like that. Similarly, when we talk about traditions, there could be many traditions. But when we say tradition, we refer to a body of knowledge, like we said, that we inherit. And that inheritance is extremely vital for our survival. Because what it does is that it gives us the raw material to make sense of the world. It gives us a know-how to understand what is happening around us, to interpret the world around us, and to give us that sense of power that we can shape our destiny. So tradition is that. Tradition is that knowledge that you inherit. And it is like an institution of institutions. When we say institution, we usually mean some body or some organization that is created for a specific purpose. So a school is an institution that imparts a certain kind of or redirects information in a certain way in different classrooms and class levels, and the end product is someone who is who has been schooled to be fit for higher education or to get into the job market. Right. So that is the telos of a school. Similarly, the tradition is a meta institution that filters out noise from information and gives you information that is workable, that can be converted into power and meaning. Power in the sense of, like I said, shaping your destiny. And what I find modernity to be is just the opposite. It is the inverse of tradition. It is anti-tradition because it filters out information and passes on noise. And that is the reason why in modern times people find it very difficult to make sense of the world, because there is no coherence and there is no order to the signal that to the information signal that you are receiving. So it's all polluted stuff. It is contaminated information, and hence the mental issues that we face in the world.
I think as long as the human civilization has existed, it is the default status of a human nature to create traditions, to make sense of his or her surrounding. In that sense, every tradition is an invented tradition. But tradition is something which is not just limited to make sense of the world, but also empower the consciousness. So as to say, if I have a particular aspiration, it could be material, it could be spiritual, but that aspiration needs to get a certain direction. That direction could be well given by tradition. And that has been the case for most part of human history. So I think the traditions function as a fence of civilization between humanity and the state of primal being.
Yeah, well, I would differ there. First of all, invented tradition is a very modern take on what tradition is, because of course everything is invented that way. But there are certain mysteries that there is no, the key has been thrown away a long time back, which perhaps will be impossible to uncover. Whether something was invented or whether something emerged from the collision of all kinds of forces, social, cultural, natural, that emergence is certainly not the agency of, is not attributable to human agency. So when we look at tradition as such, what we have inherited, like I said, the body of knowledge, it is almost, not almost, but it is eternal that way. You can treat it as eternal because the principles on which it is based, they are the deepest truths of existence, and which have survived the test of time. And saying that they have survived the test of time is an understatement, because the time scale that we are talking about is the time scale of Homo sapiens walking on Earth. So whatever that may be. So tradition that way does not have a beginning. And in that sense, we can make sense of the term Apaurushaya of the Vedas also. But these are things that preceded you in that way, and will always be there. These are truths that will not change based on your flimsy, societal norms or things or your inventions or human preferences.
Or dogmatic rationality.
Because rationality is basically model making. You create theoretical models and then test them, and then all of them eventually fail.
Right.
But tradition is not theorizing. Tradition is practice that has been adopted based on thousands and hundreds of thousands of iterations. And that cannot be thought through. That is always, passed down. So it is not a coincidence that Hindu dharma is called Sanatana Dharma, because that is an affirmation of this statement that the tradition is eternal, and what you have inherited as dharma is never going to die, because it was never born. It has always been there.
Right. Well said. But some would argue that tradition itself is an inherited attempt at rationalizing one's immediate surrounding.
What do you mean by rationalizing one's immediate surrounding?
When I get exposed to certain social conditions to which I'm not familiar with, I'm actually at horror, and then to make sense out of it, it's like finding the switch of the light in a dark room. Some would argue that tradition is that attempt.
Yeah, but that the argument does not hold, because if you look at it from a purely existential standpoint, when a child is born, it is quite likely that he's horrified by whatever he sees.
Right.
Because raw nature is frightening. There is no denial. You leave a human child in the forest, and it is likely that it will get devoured by some wild animal.
Right.
So now the question that we must put to ourselves is, what is culture and what is its relationship with nature? So culture and nature, nature on its own terms is of course frightening, but it has also gifted the human species with a brain that allows it, or that makes the species the apex predator. Even, we can kill physically much stronger species and completely even wipe them off the face of the earth. So that gift of nature comes with responsibilities.
Yes.
And culture is an acknowledgement of those responsibilities. And by the very nature of it, it is a limit that you draw to your own action. That you say, thus far and no more. Because if you don't do that, then you have the power of the gods to simply wipe off all other species, which unfortunately is happening right now.
But are you suggesting that self-censorship of tradition is subject to individual agency? So as to say that if I want to cross it, I can cross it. I have the power to do so. Can I do that?
You have the agency to do it, but the tradition or your culture defines those Lakshman Rekhas and says that this is something that you should not cross. And that in a sense is also the moral limits of your action. Whether you invoke, like these days they invoke the harm principle, that you do something which does not harm the other, without, caring to define what harm really is, right? But similarly, you can of course do anything because you are a free agent that way. But whether you should do it or not is what tradition tells you. And dharma is always a constraining force on your action. So there is no doubt about that, which is why dharma is duty oriented, not rights oriented.
So if dharma is really duty oriented, shouldn't that duty be subject to, regular scrutiny? As many people say that the conditions of your space and time. History is changing, times have changed. We like it or not, modernity is a thing. So should dharma undergo scrutiny? Because that was the case for at least the past 1.5 centuries.
Yes, in fact, to answer this question, I think we'll have to take a little bit of a deep dive into the very concept of time. When people say that the modern or the Western concept of time is linear, or the Christian idea of time is linear, and the Hindu idea of time is cyclical. What implication does that have on this question of how do you look at the past? So there is a beautiful quote by someone, I don't remember whom, but it says that we don't live in the past, but the past lives in us.
Right.
So these three tenses, the past tense, the present, and the future, these are basically past is already done and future is about to happen. Past is known and the future is unknown, but the present is what is going on. The present is the agent. So the past is assimilated by the present to shape the future. That is the traditional view. But the modern view of the past is history. There is a chronological event, there is a chronological timeline, and this is what happened, this is when this happened. And it is all external oriented. It's all oriented towards the externalities and how the outer world is functioning. While the traditional view of the past is not a historical view. It has value only so far as it can be used to shape the future. So in the framework of the Purusharthas, the past is a source of power so that you can shape the future. And the present is all that is important. Now, another distinction between the linear and the cyclical is that in the historical sense, you are always concerned about the timeline of events and all the arguments and the strife and the conflicts are about what really happened. That one true story of the past that has the stamp of authority by a church or by a university or by some think tank. So that becomes your past. And another person may have a different source of authority, and that these two histories then collide and the politics takes shape. So that is why history is so important to the political discourse of our times. But in the traditional scheme, the past is, like I said, a tool for the present to shape the future, and you don't return to the past, right? When you speak of tradition, you are not returning to the past, but you are taking recourse to the past. So there is a fundamental difference in those two approaches. You are not talking about going back to the times of the Vedic times, but you are calling for an astika way of living today. So there's a profound difference between the two, which unfortunately gets lost in the discourse because it's subtle. So it is not, again, a coincidence that our Dharma Shastra literature is called Smriti, because you remember, you recollect, and you use it for the present. So that remembrance, that recollection is not of a timeline, but of the whole thing that happened before you. And you being you are that spark behind which all this weight of the past exists, that is at your disposal to shape the future. So it's a very empowering view that way.
So in that sense, won't it be true that, smritis are in essence self-preserving? The schools which those who have taken upon the duty to preserve these smritis and produce commentaries and whatnot, they are basically doing the self-preservation on their own. Like, we don't need to intervene in any shruti and smritis. They're self-evolving. All they need is a little preservation.
So there is no evolving as such. There's no evolution as far as I see it, because it's a body of knowledge, and it's a coherent and a complete, integrated body of knowledge. We live in those times where the institutions that transmitted this body of knowledge have all collapsed. And so now we access the Shastras or the tradition pretty randomly, arbitrarily, based on our own biases, our own understanding, pro or anti-bias, whatever the case may be. But this is not how tradition was passed on in the earlier times, in the times then when we could say that tradition was alive. Today, tradition is just, it's barely surviving, and it is mostly surviving in books, not in action, or in some minuscule pockets in some Vedic Gurukul somewhere in a very limited context, right? So in those times when tradition was actually living, in those times it was passed on very systematically, and there was a long period of education similar to what we have today as schooling. But the telos of tradition versus the telos of schooling is very different. The telos of schooling, as I have explained just now, is to produce citizens who are compliant with the modern forms of political organization, and who are productive members of society in whichever society they are, and they can be employed, and they contribute to the economy. But traditionally, your education did involve this, that you become productive members of society, but that was a very small part of the setup. If you look at the traditional education in the Hindu civilization, it was all about making sense of the world again, finding meaning in your own life, and in being able to act as free agents of that same tradition, because you were so deeply connected with it. And so embodying the tradition was what education is. Today, it is more an intellectual exercise where people take sides and shoot each other's caricatures, but that is not what tradition is supposed to be in any case. And the other thing is that the medium, there's this famous thing again, which is spoken of in relation to media, modern media, that the medium is the message. Advertising में बहुत use होता है, medium is the message. So medium is the message. अगर हम traditional knowledge के बारे में हम सोच रहे हैं, तो traditional knowledge में medium is the message का क्या मतलब है? कि the way you are passing on the knowledge is a reflection of the knowledge itself. Schooling can happen without any adhikar bhed. So adhikar bhed is only applicable to traditions which which understand what adhikara is. So you have to have, so when we say that, oh, this particular knowledge was only passed on to a particular caste, right? That is because the tradition itself defines how that information has to flow. Even today, you have you have some filters in how the information flows when you go into college or school. The curriculum for class 1 is very different from the curriculum of class 5 and curriculum of class 10 and so on. So there's a progressive increase in knowledge, but what you are exposed to at a certain age is defined by that curriculum. Similarly, this is as far as the time is concerned, but also your own circumstances in which you were born, your community, your subculture, that played a part in how tradition decided who is going to be taught what, and who has the adhikar versus who doesn't have the adhikar. So I think, that part I think we'll cover in other episodes also. But I just wanted to just briefly touch upon that when we are discussing tradition.
I think for much of the criticism faced by the caste system, our modern societies are marked by some of the most deeply entrenched caste systems of all times. The system of the collar system.
Which system?
Collar system. Blue collars and white collars. For example, most of the middle class belong to white collar jobs. The jobs based on literate functions, soft skills. And if you, as a young person, if you even on a lighter note, if you give a proposition of starting something which includes a profession based on hand and eye coordination, your entire family stands in opposition to you. So in that sense, your socio-economic mobility is still affected.
No, that's a different question, but the critique to your position is that it is not based on birth. So the injustice that is perceived is because certain communities were denied a certain kind of education, and certain communities were given exclusive rights to teach that particular knowledge. And so that is the bone of contention that the moderns have, which I tried to address in the previous thing, is that what kind of knowledge and what its function is, it is important to understand. Traditional education is not the same as modern education.
Right.
And it is so stark, the difference, that it is almost like comparing day and night. So when the telos of the education itself is different, when the objectives of educating or enrolling someone in a curriculum-based education, when the objectives itself are so widely apart, so to make a comparison between the two or to judge one through the other's lens is unfair. So that is what is happening these days.
So let's say if I make this conclusion that Svadharma of a jati is actually the calculation or the assimilation of one's social conditions into their education, would that be a fair statement to make?
Yes, of course. So you are the society that we are talking about, pre-industrial society, let's say, although it goes back even further, or agricultural society. How that society was organized was not the same as today, obviously. Today there's almost a tsunami of uniformity that we are reeling under. Everyone is doing the same thing that the other is doing. There is no cultural difference. Everyone is consuming the same food, wearing the same kind of clothes, speaking the same language now, English or the major language. There is a war on diversity which is going on, and diversity in all kinds of contexts. There is a war on the diversity of the biosphere. The species are getting extinct. There is a war on the diversity of human culture in the sense of languages disappearing, cuisines disappearing, humor. The same kind of humor is now, everyone watches the same kind of, consumes the same kind of humor. The small things with the disappearance of language, very quirky, one-liners that you would hear in Haryana or in Kashmir or in other parts. Those are disappearing. So cultural decline is very apparent, very straightforward, and at the same time, there is just a thrust on being similar to, same as the other. So in this kind of a cultural milieu where everything is the same, the education and the expectations from the education and who should get educated how, there is no question about it, because everyone is basically living in the same world. But in the previous eras where there was a very great diversity and a heterogeneity built within society, in those times, obviously, you can't have a one-size-fit-all education. So then you would have to draw boundaries. You would have to say, you would have to make those rules about who gets access to what, and what are the costs and penalties associated with transgressing those boundaries. That's all very normal. There is no conspiracy theory behind it. But if you, in today's discourse, anything goes. Anyone can say anything about stuff, and take a mic and shout, and 10,000 people will be there to listen to you. The question is, in today's political climate, what are these institutions like political parties? What are they doing? What is their goal? How does democracy operate? What are the time scales they are catering to? Or what are the time scales that they have to plan according to? And you will find that in an electoral process of 5 years, the institution of a political party is always looking at regaining power in the next 5 years. And as the regime, as the time goes on, the time getting diminished. And as you approach the next elections, there is frantic effort to do whatever in order to win the next election. And so that becomes the primary goal. So in that, wherever you find faults and, in these narratives, and whatever narrative you find suitable, you will employ that in the service of gaining power. And therefore, this whole caste business of blaming everything on caste and finding faults with this old system of, order, it's basically a political project. And that also a political project which is driven by electoral compulsions. It is not a political project in the sense that it's a collective project, because politics means actually participating in collective life. But that is not how democracy operates. In democracy, politics means, simply giving up agency to these political parties who will manipulate public opinion to serve their own purpose.
I think democracy's default status is to be in permanent state of borrowing from the future.
Oh yes, in all kinds.
It's a vicious cycle. No?
In all kinds of contexts, yes.
And tradition is just opposite of that.
Yes, tradition operates in long-term cycles, in long-time cycles, and that is why the wheel of dharma is it imagines time in the scales that we know. Famously that the Hindu time scales are billions of years. So that is not a scientific. It's not a scientific estimate. It is a narrative estimate. It's saying that dharma operates in such large cycles, and you, as someone who's alive today, this moment of being alive is eternal. So again, going back to the question of history, what tradition tells you is that you have to digest and assimilate the past in order to escape time.
Right.
So the power that tradition gives you, the power of sense making, the power of meaning, is ultimately in the service of escaping time, escaping these constraints of past, present, and future.
To liberate oneself.
Yes. So that is the ultimate. Okay. So that is why I said that the telos of tradition is sense-making at a lower level. Ultimately, it is mukti. And compare that with any other ideology. Tradition is not an ideology. Tradition is a body of knowledge and a tried and tested method of living, a way of life. It is both simultaneously. And ideologies are like memes. That what is applicable today is not applicable tomorrow. What is applicable in a given context is disastrous in another. So even an ideology like Hindutva, for example, it may be very important or very useful in the context of electoral politics. But if you translate that to social life, then it could actually have a lot of problems. That is the nature of ideologies. And unfortunately, our discourse, even the intelligentsia, so to speak, of today on the Hindu side, do not recognize any limits to ideology. It is almost like ideology is the ultimate truth, and that if you don't subscribe to an ideology, then you are basically an enemy or an outcast.
One interesting thing to note is that, across the entire ideological spectrum, the default status of ideologues and ideologies is the status of being a revanchist. To crush the existing paraphernalia of ritualism and whatnot, to standardize people, to create a base, make individuals and masses out of communities. And then after that destruction, you again end up on that pedestal where you are rearranging people into neo communities.
Correct.
So the entire process becomes futile, because that was the original state we were in, and ultimately ideologies have thrown us into alternative traditions, where we in the sense the humanity, where ideology is totally won over.
Yes,
they had to create traditions out of thin air to make sense.
Yes, correct. They have to create pseudo traditions. They have to create vikalp. They have to create other alternatives, synthetic options, plastic options, artificial, because you need that kind of structure to survive. And without that, everything will just fall apart. And because you have given up on tradition, or not given up, but by the nature of circumstances or the force of circumstances, you have been disconnected from tradition. Now, to understand tradition is a much more challenging thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do, and it requires a lot of revamp, let's say. But to create, alternative models is easier while spitting at tradition. So this is again catering to smaller time cycles, because that is easier thing to do, and it's more incentivized in today's world. Right. But I want to sort of use this opportunity to explain another facet of what is tradition, what it is not, and how it relates to dharma and adharma. And I want to use the metaphor, central metaphor, one of the most important metaphors of Hindu mythology, which is the Samudramanthan, the churning of the ocean. The churning of the ocean में आपका एक side से देवता है, एक side से असुर है, and they are both, pulling at the Vasuki, and they're trying to create that nectar. And ultimately, obviously the asuras are more powerful, and the devatas appeal to the higher gods, and the gods intervene, and they trick the asuras out of that competition, and hand over the nectar, the nectar of immortality, to the devatas. In this metaphor, in this scheme, asuras are supposed to be representative of adharma, and devatas are supposed to be representative of dharma. So this metaphor is actually the dharma yuddha going on. And again, this nectar of immortality is the escape from time, right? Which I was just referring to. So if you transpose this metaphor, like I said, that this is dharma versus adharma at one level, at the deepest level, it is also the dichotomy between nature and culture. It is also the dichotomy between tradition and modernity, between polytheism and monotheism, right? And between, let's say, purushartha and hedonism. How? Because in this myth of devatas and asuras, both devatas and asuras have emerged or are the sons of Rishi Kashyap from his two wives. So the source is the same. And even the gods, the great gods that appear, who are representative of the highest, the supreme reality, they treat both of them equally in a lot of ways. But ultimately, they have this bias towards the devatas. Why is there that bias? So that question itself, if we are able to unpack that, we will be able to get a glimpse of what tradition really is. And so that bias is on account of, let's say, when I described tradition as an ecosystem, right? That it is a meta institution. It is an ecosystem, a web of relationships, which consists of both knowledge and practice. So the reformist tendency is to take out some bit of it. Like the Hindu tradition, for example, does have an element of egalitarianism in it. Right? Because egalitarianism in a certain context is desirable. But if you take egalitarianism out of tradition and then decontextualize it and treat it as the ultimate objective or something which can be pursued regardless of context, then you have taken something out of an ecosystem and isolated it. It is very similar to how you can take out a species from another ecosystem, from the, let's say, a forest. You take out, or from a pond, you take out a certain species of fish and put them in another pond, and they will likely not survive, right?
But that would be universalization, and when they would argue.
No, that's what it is. Universalization means what? Universalization means that you take something out, decontextualize it, and then treat it as an end in itself.
Isn't that a good thing?
No, how is it? That is exactly what I'm trying to explain.
Okay.
That this principle of dharma versus adharma is just that. Asuras versus devatas is just that. Devatas are respectful of their place in the universal scheme of things. They are powerful, but they are mindful of hierarchy. They are mindful of not stepping on the toes of another devata. They have their jurisdiction, they have their portfolio. Like a cabinet minister, they know what they're supposed to do. You go to Varuna for something, you go to Indra for something else, you go to Devi for something else. Or, I'm talking about the devatas, not the greater gods, right? Those are beyond time. So, when you compare that with asuras, asuras have this tendency of saying that everything is me only, right?
It's total entropy.
Yeah, no, entropy follows, but that instinct, the asuric instinct, is of a disregard for any relationship. It is a complete annihilation of that web of relationships, because you are a node in that web, but you don't want anyone else to be recognized or worshipped, because you want to be the supreme. So that is how, that is universalization of one element of that ecosystem. So that is exactly how adharma is. That it is also, it is derived from dharmic ideas, but it is isolated and made into an end in itself. I gave the example of egalitarianism, for example, right? Universalizing one small feature is what it is. Similarly, look at polytheism, you look at monotheism. So you derive one god out of a set of gods, isolate him and say he is the only one. This is actually asuric. This is what asura is. Same thing you look at in the Purushartha framework. Purusharthas allow you to fulfill your desires. Kama is a valid Purushartha. It is legit. But if you take Kama out of the Purushartha framework and you disregard all other Purusharthas and say that no, I will only fulfill my own self, that is hedonism. That is adharma. Again, nature and culture, we were talking about. Culture is that what defines your boundaries. You take out culture from nature. What happened in the West, what happened with modernity, there is a severance of that relationship between how humans live and how nature operates. And you are out there to conquer nature, that metaphor of conquering nature, because you have separated yourself from nature and you are only looking at human ideals now. Human ideals are the end all and be all of it all, without regard to even biological realities. So you employ technology to transgress the boundaries that nature had defined for you. This gender drama that happens these days. That you can even change your gender by technological intervention, because you can. If you can, you will. You should. That is the idea. But that is not how real culture operates. Culture then defines boundaries. They say, no. If nature has asked you to, stay in your lane, so you better not cross over. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you apply the metaphor of Samudramanthan to different contexts and different levels of being, different levels of consciousness, then it will produce these dichotomies. Nature versus culture, this dharma versus adharma, purushartha versus hedonism, and ultimately tradition versus modernity. So tradition is the whole, and modernity derives or takes out, extracts some part of the tradition and universalizes it and makes it an end in itself. Right? While appealing to being critical of tradition. Like, we reject everything that came before us. We have no regard for tradition because that is the right way to be, because tradition is oppressive by design. That is the argument of modernity. It has, we are liberated and tradition is oppressive. Therefore, we need to criticize everything that came before us. Because finally we are now we were sleeping. All our ancestors were idiots. They were sleeping. Suddenly we have woken up. Now we will look at it and we will reform society. That reformism is that instinct of adharma, is that instinct of asura, is what I'm trying to say.
I think there is an element of anthropocentrism involved, definitely. Like human conscious has a certain superior value to the rest of the conscious universe or world, whatever. And that itself is subject to accumulation of ego, which has been described, in the Shastras as adharma.
In the Shastras, if we go by the Shastric definition, I think ahankara is again not it cannot be spoken of without addressing the context. Ahankara is a state of being also, right? Ahankara is the I-ness that we have. And it's a part of human consciousness, a very, very fundamental, very foundational part of human consciousness. But ahankara, when it is applied to a social setting, that is a different thing. He's बहुत ahankari hai. He's only thinking about himself. It's self-centered. It's selfish. But that also is, again, this extraction of a single thing and looking at it out of context, or taking it out of context. Like, we have that feeling of I-ness, What do we do about it is what tradition informs us. If we are not connected to that tradition, we will perhaps become egoistic and selfish.
I believe it's a catch-22 situation. That if we ignore this, the sense of I-ness, we will fall into the primal state of being like other animals. And if we acknowledge
cannot ignore it. First of all, we cannot ignore I-ness. This is our nature. Ahankara is very much part of our existence. It is who we are. So it is not even possible to discard it. It is possible to transcend it. And that is what mukti is, arguably. I'm not mukt, so I cannot say. but that is what the sages have described as being jivan mukta. And if you have transcended your separateness, the feeling of separateness, in the real sense of the word, not in terms of lip service that mujhe koi farak nahi padta, but actually in practice, then you are liberated. You have attained jivan mukti. But as long as you have not done that, then you better acknowledge that it is there, and you need not misuse it. And not misusing it means that you self-correct yourself. You draw lines to your own behavior, your conduct. And where do those lines come from? They come from the culture that you inherit. And that culture is what? Informed by what? Informed by the body of knowledge called tradition. So there is no way out of of drawing from tradition ultimately.
So let's try to zoom in on particular the corpus of Hindu traditions. Now, we have talked a lot about the evolution and the conception of tradition and its role in our society. And now it's been around 2 centuries of modernity for Indians, for Hindus, whatever. Why are we even discussing about it? Like, many people would say that modernity has introduced an element of irreversible change. That no matter how much we can argue, or we can hark about the golden times of the past, we cannot go back to it. So why are we even discussing about
we are not crystal ball gazers. We don't know what the future will look like. So let's drop any pretensions of saying that this is irreversible and that is reversible. How do we know? कल को कुछ ऐसा हो जाए, कोई catastrophe हो जाए, या we move on to a different era of this is the Anthropocene era. What will post-Anthropocene era look like? Do we know? Do we have answers to that? No. So let's stop pretending that. But what we can do in the meanwhile is that we can look around us, observe, and see what is wrong around us. Instead of imagining what was wrong 2000 years ago, we can look around us today and empirically arrive at what is wrong around us. And what is the source of that wrongness. And if we are honest about it, then we will eventually come to the conclusion that there is a lack of order, there is a lack of culture, there is a lack of diversity, there is too much manipulation, there is too much propaganda, aided by technology, there is a loss of sense making. All these problems can only be addressed by taking the recourse to tradition, because the tradition is all we have.
So in essence, tradition is the Indrajal of interconnectedness.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
It binds us together.
And so that is what I'm saying. I want to come back to that question of reformism again, because when you say that I want to reform tradition, there is a huge epistemic arrogance involved in that assumption that you as an individual who's deracinated, cut off from any viable, sustainable way of life, and who's been indoctrinated in school to serve the agenda of modern corporations and state and all kinds of institutions, and who's now using technology that has the power of the gods. This is like comparing, I can only think of something as ridiculous as a monkey flying a jet plane, right? You could take it anywhere. We don't even know where it will go. So in that situation, it is very silly to say that I will now come and I will lecture others on how to reform tradition. You don't even know what tradition is. So the better approach is to understand it on its own terms. Try to understand, given that there are no formal ways of learning anymore. There are no institutions. We don't have gurukuls. We don't have that long training that our ancestors used to have in all these various kinds of knowledge. So the best that we can do is be respectful towards it, learn what we can, try to apply it in our lives, and see if we can individually gain some agency, gain some power and control over where we are headed and where our next generation is going to be headed.
What is the epistemic root of Hindu traditions?
Vedas. The Vedic corpus.
Vedas.
The Vedas being Apaurusheya are eternal. So I don't know if, when they say that, they say that, of course they were written by a man. Yeah. That is common sense. But, you need to understand narrative structures. You need to understand what it means by Apaurusheya. And there are truths that are always existing and they're channeled through the rishis. And the rishis are not, अगली किराने की दुकान पर बैठा हुआ आदमी नहीं है कि कोई भी बन जाए. Rishis are rishis because they were born as rishis. Period. And it's over. There's no discussion. You and I can't become rishis. Let us drop those pretensions. So I don't know why we have to even spell this out, but that's how it is. So that is the root of our and because they need to be Apaurusheya. If you're making the claim that the tradition is eternal, if we are Sanatan Dharma, how can a dharma which is Sanatan, which is eternal, be based on something which is of human agents, of human authorship? There's a logical fallacy out there. So either you drop the name Sanatan, or you accept the eternality of the Veda as such.
So I'm assuming that your understanding of Hindu traditions include only the Vedas and not the Puranas and Agamas and Tantras and whatnot. These are later day interpolations.
Agam और निगम तो दोनों ये हैं, मतलब parallels हैं. So there is the Vedic stream, there is the Agamic stream. I'm saying that mainstream Hindu Samaj and the Dharma Shastras derive their authority from Shruti, which is Veda. Now there are other texts like the Tantras, which also derive authority from, they are also considered Shruti within their tradition. But since the Tantras have no bearing on, or very less bearing on social life as such, Tantras are manuals of sadhana, and they are very individualistic that way, that you are your guru instructs you in a certain practice using a certain tantra, and it is for your liberation. Dharma Shastras are for society. So when we say that the Hindu tradition is based on, and the Hindu society, Hindu civilization is based on the Veda, it is in accordance with this distinction between the Agama and the Veda. Not because Agamas are not important, but they don't have a bearing on the social life and such.
So in essence, the Vedic tradition includes the entirety of the Vedic corpus.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So there is no interpolation in Puranas. I just want to hear that from your face, like straight away.
Whether there is interpolation in Puranas or not is not a question that is raised as part of the tradition. There are authorities that have recognized which Puranas are are part of the corpus. And suppose tomorrow I write a Dilli Purana, so that will not become part of the Puranic literature, right? You write something about Saharanpur Purana, तो वो थोड़ी बन जाता है. But what we have been handed over, that Puranic literature is derived from the Vedic truths. And this has been attested over and over by hundreds of acharyas over thousands of years. So, who am I to question that? For me, what I have inherited today, the past, the entire past, is to be processed, is to be used. Like I said, if you look at tradition as an ecosystem of information, it is an information ecology that way. Then you cannot extract bits out of it without changing the nature of that. You cannot isolate anything. So you cannot say that, oh, within this Ramayana, I don't like the Shambhuka killing, so I will reject it. Then that is not how it operates. You have it. It is there. It is for you to rationalize and to understand it on its own terms. It stays. If you are not able to reconcile, you look around, your journey is not over. You look for the right explanation. Chances are that before you die, you may get it. You may die a thirsty person. There is no guarantee. but that's how it is. But you have no authority to say that, no, we will reject it because I don't like it.
So I have two questions for you now. Like, one is, of course, your average 20th century Hindu reformist would say, take the good things from the Shastras, leave the bad things. So you are saying that either you are accepting the entirety of the corpus or you are rejecting it.
Yes.
And now we have, the reformist schools, which basically emphasize on this selective assimilation.
Yes, because they have historicized the past. As S.N. Balagangadhar would say, they have completely bought into this modern narrative of history. And they believe that their explanation of how things happened has any value. So they take themselves too seriously and they say that, oh, this is why it is. And there was a conspiracy. Why was, for example, the question of why Shudras were not taught the Vedas. So the simplest explanation is often the correct explanation and is also the most elegant explanation. And that simplest explanation is that Shudras had their own education. They had their own curriculum based on their own practices, their own occupations. And so they did not have the time or the inclination or the incentive to study the Vedas. And if they would, then it would lead to confusion and chaos in society, because then who is going to carry forward that lineage? Let's say you are born in a family of artists or some or carpenters. Then it is your duty to follow that. That was how it was arranged back then. And so because it is also the most easiest path for you, the most obvious path for you. There are no industries, you can't apply for jobs. So you will do what you want. Now, if you go for Vedic education, then that will take 10 to 15 years of your life. Then how will you get assimilated back into your community? So it was not even a choice. So that is why there were very clear rules of who can do what, and it is well defined.
I don't even know why there is an entire hubris around Vedadikara, when it is being historically proven that it was one of the most poverty-based tradition. Materially speaking.
Correct.
Most of the Vedadikaris, they lived very humble
frugally
lives.
Yeah. Very frugal lives.
They were not allowed to accumulate any kind of wealth. Hold.
Yes.
Most of Brahmin population was not able to do that.
Correct. That's right. So no, but it's easier to it's just easy to muddy the waters. No, you have information, and that information can be polluted. Like you have water that can be contaminated, information can be polluted. And if there is incentive to pollute the information, like there is incentive to pollute your river and other water bodies, because you don't know what to do with the effluents that have been. Similarly, in the political process, when you have manipulation of information for certain ends, there is an end product. That end product is a pollutant, but you will anyway dump it on the past. But coming back to your question of why, I mean, these reformers, or the modern reformers of the neo sects, they historicize the past and they buy that argument of modernity, which is another form of Christianity, and they imagine that they're going back to some pristine original state. That is a very liberal approach. So, because you imagine that the past was free of all issues, and then there was a conspiracy, and some classes conspired against others to hoard all the wealth and power. And so then it becomes important for you to reverse that tide and say that, oh, all that came later was a corruption, and we need to go back to the original. But there is, like I said, it's a complete whole. It's complete in itself, and it's an ecosystem. It's an information ecology. You simply cannot discard one part, take it, and leave the rest. You cannot extract out of that. Which is why I went into that explanation to draw that analogy. So the reformist, what they do is a self-defeating exercise.
Even the seemingly traditionalist figures like Gandhiji, for example, like he was considered as a traditionalist because he said no, he believed in Varna Vyavastha and whatnot. Even he said this, that take the good things from Shastras, and if some
whoever it was, because you see, Gandhi was a politician, and his motivations were different. They were not about, even though he wrote My Experiments with the Truth, he was not, in public life, he was not seeking the truth. He was seeking peace and reconciliation. And perhaps he was looking at, in very good faith, he was looking at a society which had rid itself of all the evils of modern life. And I mean, we must acknowledge that in the modern period, caste became a tool of oppression. But that is not how it is supposed to be. It's an inescapable reality in a lot of ways. And it's almost like saying that the family has become an oppressive institution today. If there is domestic abuse, marriage as an institution is turning oppressive. So everything is falling apart. Like I said, if we look at today, हम आज की समीक्षा करें, तो हमें 10 चीजें मिल जाएगी जो हम empirically claim कर सकते हैं कि हाँ ये गलत हो रहा है. लेकिन अगर हम past में जाने की कोशिश करके उसको criticize करें, तो that's a foolish exercise.
So now we proceed to the end of our conversation for now. It's already too long. So I'll take a couple of questions and we'll have a quick banter over it. So why do you think traditionalism today needs preservation and not evolution? The intricate relationship between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, for example, the savoring of which will simply be to throw the baby with the hot water.
The bath water.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the bath water.
Yes, the water will be cold also. No, so the question is of evolution versus?
Yeah, preservation.
So, tradition is neither preserved nor does it change. It operates in deep time.
It adapts.
It may adapt. Let me explain. Tradition operates in deep time. What is deep time? Deep time is time scales that extend far beyond human timescales, like we were just talking about. And in that sense, from one point of time to another, in that deep time, the tradition may have changed. But from our perspective, it does not. Because we are a blip in comparison to these timescales. And so for practical purposes, for us, tradition cannot change. If it changes, it will change over several generations, and it has its own mechanism of change and adaptation. So to call for change is a self-defeating exercise, because that change happens on its own. It is not willed by, or it is not planned that way. 5-year plan नहीं है नेहरू का कि आपने आज बोला कि अब मैं ट्रेडिशन में मुझे इससे प्रॉब्लम है तो मैं 20 साल का प्लान बना के इसको 20 साल में चेंज करता हूँ. वो नहीं होता. You only destroy it. You are capable of destroying tradition for yourself and for people who are influenced by you. But as such, it does not change.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't this the same concept as Chesterton's principle, that fence wala?
Which is?
You don't remove the social customs until you understand why were they put in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. That's a more relatable take on tradition. What I was referring to was slightly more philosophical, if I may use that word. But yes, what he has described as that the law of that fence is absolutely applicable on all kinds of customs. I think it is more applicable to customs than it is to tradition.
Oh. Right. So moving to the next question is...
Are these questions that you have outsourced and found from somewhere, or these are questions that you have imagined people asking?
These are being funded by superior forces.
By Soros.
Yeah. Who are at war with, I don't know. I don't want to name. So what do you think of the role of tradition in the preservation of Dharma through thick and thin times of history?
Tradition is Dharma only. There is no difference between the two, as far as I see it. And so, tradition, when it is, when it is attacked by all kinds of forces, whether by barbarians or by progressives, they're basically the same. I'm sorry, I had to say this joke. It is not meant to disparage any people. But when it is under duress, it has its self-preservation mechanisms. And I think one of the success stories there for the Hindu tradition is the role of ritual in self-preservation. That we were handed down, in spite of the complete collapse of the entire ecosystem of institutions that are taught and that passed on tradition, we were able to still retain that connect and the respect for our traditional knowledge and civilization because we were ritualistic. And so that ritual continued, and we may have forgotten why the ritual was there in the first place, that fence thing.
Right.
But it still forces us to explore and to understand. And so that is also part of the sense making.
I think this one is my favorite, but we have already done it. But still, I'll ask for funs. Who is a rishi? Can I become a rishi?
Yes, you can be named Rishi, renamed. You can apply for that in the local MCD office and be called Rishi Sinha from tomorrow. But I'm sorry to inform you, sir, that you cannot become a Rishi, even if you have great siddhis at your disposal and you are a great intellectual. No, that's not what a Rishi is.
I may well cope with this truth, but I don't know how many people are going to take that.
No, it's used very loosely, but it's okay. I mean, some people use rishi to denote higher knowledge and the status of being a saint and all that. I think that is pretty much harmless as long as we can maintain that distinction between what a rishi is formally speaking and how it is colloquially employed as a term.
Does our Shastra define the limits of our collective identity? In simple words, what would be the Shastriya definition of a Hindu, if any?
I think on that note, we can end this discussion because this who is a Hindu may perhaps be a topic of discussion for another episode. Yeah, but no, yeah. So the Shastra is not really concerned with identity politics, but yes, it is concerned with adhikar bhed. And in that, it has given a certain privilege to people living or born in this subcontinent, the Jambu Dweep. And they are the Aryas. And whether they came from the steppes or whether Aryas migrated from India to Europe and Iran, that is a question for academics, and it has a very important role in the politics of today. We cannot simply, condemn that question or hold in contempt those who are jostling in that with that struggle. But as far as the Shastra is concerned, it is more concerned about adhikara, as I said, and who is eligible to learn a certain or acquire a certain knowledge and live in a certain way. So in that, they are very clear about all that. Yet it is in deep time, the tradition did evolve to accommodate even foreigners who in the Vedic scheme are called mlechas. So in the tantras, for example, in many tantric sampradayas, there is no bar on initiating even a mlecha. You will see that in even today, a lot of tantric schools do welcome or encourage outsiders also to take diksha. So they're not going against tradition that way. But the rules for the tantric and the Vedic are different because the Vedic has a bearing on society and culture. Tantric is a more individualistic thing. So that is why the distinction is there. It is not that the Tantra was a revolt against the Vedas.
Pretty much everything has been said and stated, but conclusion would be a fair observation of mine would be as a very simple person, not any authority, is that tradition allows me a certain agency to make sense of what I am. To rebuild, my sense of belongingness with my surroundings. It makes me aware of the possibilities, and it makes me responsible towards it, so that I don't consume it to extinction. So that's what tradition is for me.
Right. Yeah. So I would also like to reiterate my understanding of tradition, which is that it is again an information ecology, a body of knowledge that you inherit not in parts but as a whole, and which you may apply in parts, and that also is defined by the tradition only, and namely, what we would call the sampradayas, for example, that in the whole body of knowledge, you cannot, one lifetime is not enough, or even 100 lifetimes may not be enough, given that the knowledge has the source in eternity. So you will have to pick and choose what you want to learn, and that the tradition will define based on how it judges you as a receptor of that knowledge. And so the curriculum of your education that way is based on the circumstances of your birth. And in some cases, it is not, like in the tantric scheme. So there is no controversy there at all, actually, if you look at it. But because the water has been polluted, the information ecology is deliberately getting polluted by these effluents, political effluents. So a lot of misinformation has been created about, they were not taught to read and write and things like that. This is all bullshit. So all the attack on tradition happens due to either a misunderstanding or a deliberate distortion of what tradition means because if you state it honestly, then your own telos, your own objectives are compromised when we are speaking of certain institutions. So I just want to end with saying that tradition must be given a fair chance, and understanding tradition is not easy, which is why we had this complete, it's almost like saying our civilization is a knowledge-based civilization. So therefore, when we place knowledge at such a pedestal, then everything becomes it becomes subservient to that goal of attaining knowledge in parts. And so the whole society was organized to enable an individual to transcend the limitations of time. And there was no movement in the other direction of historicizing, because that they recognized, our ancestors recognized, would be a disastrous step. It would be a huge loss, because then you would fall into the trap of time and not be able to escape it. And that Asuric tendency is what we saw in the Protestant Reformation, for example, and generally in Christianity. So when we speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it is actually an anti-tradition, because it was a revolt against the pre-existing pagan tradition. And whatever we saw of a revival in the spirit of the Western world, namely the Renaissance, where you saw a flowering of artistic expression and scientific exploration and things like that. That was the converted Christians rediscovering their pagan past, right? So that pagan tradition that existed before Christianity, what happened to that under this reformist zeal of Christianity is what is at stake today also, as far as the Hindu tradition is concerned. We have already ceded a lot of space. We have lost territory. We have lost mind space in society as such, in Hindu society also. People don't know what tradition is. So I think for our generation, the task is very clearly cut out, that we have to regain that space, and we have to regain that by articulating the traditional perspective clearly, succinctly, and to the best of our abilities, because we should be aware that we don't understand tradition fully. And in that, I will go back to my initial remarks that a dialogue with the so-called reformists is essential, because not all reformists are bad faith reformists. Some are simply doing it out of ignorance, as far as our perspective is concerned. They might have the same thing for us. So it is important to engage in dialogue. And with that, I think this would be a good start to that process. And I hope that this will not just speak to, this is not going to end up like preaching to the choir, that we are speaking to the converted, but that this message of ours and this discussion benefits others as well, who think of tradition as some sort of a demon, something that should be avoided or slayed.
Right.
So that is something that if we are able to do, if this is this conversation benefits people who are unaware of tradition, I think that we would have done our job.
I just wanted to add the need to emphasize this before ending this conversation, that modern Indian history should be looked as a microcosm of what happened in Europe in the past 1,000 years. The Christianization and the later, the Protestant movement and Renaissance. And if we see modern Indian history in that context, we could actually bring in a real revival of traditionalism. A real Hindu Renaissance could be seen, where the society en masse would rediscover their own traditions without any baggage of, colonial lens or whatever, without any baggage of seeking approval from those who have been the historical oppressors of Hindu traditions. And then who knows, possibilities are endless.
Correct. I think that, part of that would be to revive the traditional institutions also. Because I don't think, like I said, medium is the message. And so without reviving those institutions, this hope will just die out, because the state can never do it.
So on that note, thank you, Ashish ji, for being such a patient, host with me. And that brings us to...
तुम्हारी payment मिल जाएगी.
कहाँ से? यही बताइए. Full disclosure, कहाँ से?
Please donate to Upward so that I can pay Aditya the bribe for tolerating me for so long.
So on that note, we end this conversation for now.
Yeah.
And we hope to bring more of such subjects in the future episodes. Thank you. Dharm ki jai ho.
Dharm ki jai ho.